candle burns, but the room is empty. Welcome to Agent Ash. I am your host, Hallo. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Your messages always make this adventure brighter. Let's step into the story. It was one of those evenings when the air had a weight to it, as if the damp had decided to settle in for good among the stones and spires. Oxford, in its weary grandeur, always wore autumn better than summer, and that night the lanes seemed to bend beneath a veil of mist that curled like smoke around the lamps. Students, in their clusters of laughter and wine breath, hurried across quads and cloisters, their voices oddly bright against the muffled stillness. I watched them for a moment before turning away. One grows older, and the sound of youthful noise begins to echo differently, not as invitation, but as reminder. The porter at St. Luke's told me later that he had paused halfway along his round, struck by a candle flickering where no candle ought to be. It was in the window of Professor Harlan's study, high above the first court, a window rarely lit past dinner. The porter had expected silence, perhaps the scratching of Harlan's pen if the old fellow had been unable to sleep. But the door to the study had been locked, and though he tried the handle twice, there was no sound within. He passed on, uneasy, and made his note in the book as always. Duty had boundaries after all, and a candle in a scholar's room was hardly cause to summon alarm. I have thought often since of that small flame. How a light can speak without voice, can suggest a presence or a promise, and yet be nothing more than wax and wick consuming themselves in silence. The porter told me he stood in the quad afterwards, watching his breath drift pale in the air, and found himself listening for footsteps that did not come. When morning arrived, Harlan was nowhere to be found. His study remained locked from within, the candle extinguished, its stub a mute sentinel beside an empty glass. The bed in his rooms was untouched. His lecture notes lay in neat stacks, and his gown still hung where it had been the previous day. It was as if he had walked out of his life with the casualness of a man stepping off a train at the wrong station. I was called to St. Luke's, not for a murder, not then, but for a disappearance. A missing professor is hardly a matter for trumpets, but there was something in the way the master of the college spoke on the telephone that sharpened my attention. There had been, he said, minor tensions in the senior common room. An academic of Harlan's stature did not simply absent himself without warning. The word simply never sat well with me. When Lewis and I arrived, the college was already stirring into its usual routines, bells marking chapel, bicycle wheels rattling on gravel, the faint smell of toast escaping from hall. Yet a hush hung about the staircase that led to Harlan's study. Dust lingered where his shoes had not brushed it. The porter's logbook contained its plain entry, 9:40 p.m., candle lit, door locked. No more, no less. I examined the study with the care one reserves for an old text whose meaning has been half erased, the wine glass, rim-stained, still damp. A book of medieval verse open at a passage Harlan had lectured on the week before. The candle stub tilted slightly in its holder, as if the last inch of wax had sagged in exhaustion. Nothing remarkable, except that everything remained in such deliberate order. Scholars may be careless, but they are seldom so consistent in their neatness. Lewis, practical as ever, wondered aloud whether Harlan had gone walking by the river and simply failed to return. It was possible. But the candle troubled me. Why light it if he intended absence? And why extinguish it before leaving, unless he had never truly left at all? From the window the porter had watched, I could see the angle of light across the quad. Anyone walking through that misty courtyard would have noticed it. A small flare of domestic life in a building otherwise shuttered. It might have been signal, or habit, or nothing at all. But in Oxford, I had learned, Nothing at all was rarely so simple. As I closed the study door behind me, the air of the corridor pressed in with its own kind of silence. Old wood creaked. Somewhere distant, a chapel choir rehearsed a hymn, its notes blurred by rain on stone. The porter hovered, uncertain, and asked if we had found anything. I told him no, not yet, though in truth I had found a question, which is sometimes more troublesome than an answer. That night, as I sat alone with a crossword and a whiskey, the clue that stared back at me read, "Absent light, endless night, 7." I wrote nothing in the square, though the word hovered at the edge of thought. Candles, I knew, are never merely candles. They illuminate what is missing as much as what is seen. Lewis drove while Oxford shook the rain from its sleeves. Roofs darkened, pavements shone. The master of St. Luke's had sounded composed on the telephone, yet composure carries a smell of what lies beneath. A scholar missing is an administrative nuisance until small facts begin to insist upon breath and time. At the lodge, the porter received us with the gravity of a man who respects routine and fears its betrayal. The candle had been seen by 2 students returning from hall. The door had remained locked. The key was not on its hook. He last saw Harland at evensong, crossing the quad with a wrapped book and the gait of a man doing sums with himself. The master led us up a stair that answered back with wooden aches. When the lock yielded and permission had been granted, the study greeted us with the unaccusing silence of good housekeeping. Papers lay in obedient piles. The clock ticked with unhelpful composure. A fountain pen slept across a blotter like a small bridge. The glass of claret was half finished. Harland, by reputation, heard false rhymes at a easy distance. I moved to the desk. A slip of paper bore a hurried sentence in pencil, the letters tall and precipitous. "When I am dead, think only this of me." Below, in smaller hand, Brooke. I stood longer than was polite. The line belongs to Rupert Brooke, yet the posture of comfort felt wrong, and, more to the point, Harland was not a careless quoter. Either he wrote without attention, or someone wanted a scholar to look foolish. Lewis produced an astonishment with the offhand pride of a conjurer. In the grate lay the ash of a letter. A surviving corner showed a college crest that was not St. Luke's. Rivalries, he suggested. The master, invited to delicacy, allowed disagreements. There had been committee debates over a new chair, the kind that relocates money and pride. He named Dr. Leonard Ashe with smoothness, and Dr. Miriam Foster with care. A quieter syllable followed. Claire Davenant, once a student, lately a lecturer, and, rumours said, entangled with Harland recently. Family, I asked. None, said the master, unless one counted the college, which many of us, to our cost, do. There is an older will leaving a modest bequest to the library. There may be a later document. There is talk of it after dinner when sense loosens its collar. We searched without theatre. The wardrobe kept its dignity. The bed, still made, preserved a shape. In the desk I found the wrapped book the porter had noticed, a library copy of a 14th century miscellany, plate warning against removal. On the flyleaf, dry ink, for one who always misquotes. No signature. Lewis said it sounded like a joke thinned into spite. I said nothing. Jokes are often measurements disguised as laughter. At the window, rain rehearsed itself on stone. The quad seemed to hold its breath. I imagined the candle as the students had seen it, a blade of habitation against damp air. If Harland placed it, he wanted to be noticed. If another did, the notice was the point. On the way out, Lewis asked what I made of the scrap. The poet is misattributed, I said, and perhaps the sentiment too. Think only this of me is the boast of men who planned their elegies. Harland planned something else. Lewis offered the river, and an accident. I told him, accidents seldom tidy rooms and misquote sonnets. Back at the lodge, the porter produced a whisper meant to be overheard. Dr. Ashe had been seen leaving by the side gate near midnight, coat collar up, face turned toward the meadows. He drove off in the rain. The number taken down by a junior porter had one digit uncertain. I told Lewis to get the book. Uncertainty, once written, has a habit of repeating itself. That night, over a crossword and a thin whiskey, I stared at a clue that would not resolve. Candle's purpose confuses seer at heart. 7. I wrote nothing. Some answers arrive only when the day has emptied the room enough to hear them. Rain made a soft hiss along the stone as Lewis and I entered the senior common room. The place had that collegiate scent of beeswax, tea leaves, and the paper dust of journals no one will ever finish. Rooms like this pretend to be hospitable while counting their silver. Miriam Foster sat first, hands folded, gaze steady, voice trimmed of warmth. "We worked together once," she said, and allowed the sentence to end where kindness would have begun. Harland was exact men bruise. Had she seen him after Hall? She had seen a square of light in his window and nothing more. "Rituals tire me," she added, and somehow made the college candle offend twice. Leonard Ashe arrived at a pace that implied meetings even when none existed. He set down papers as if they were permissions granted. "The college mustn't wobble," he said. "Students expect continuity, donors reassurance." He admired Harlan's scholarship and corrected his manners. When I asked about last night, he said he left by the side gate because the main one sticks in rain. He did not know the porter had noted a car number with one uncertain digit. Claire Davenant came without ceremony. She carried the fatigue of those who have been explained by others. "I owe him much," she said. And then, after a silence that refused to close, he could be needlessly severe. Where had she been? With friends near Jericho. Which friends? Names were offered that fitted too neatly, the way alibis sometimes do when the heart edits. Tea arrived and arranged civility upon saucers. The master poured like a man who never drinks. Conversation moved around the edges of what mattered. Foster praised rigor the way a surgeon praises anesthesia. Ashe rehearsed stability and spoke of reputations as if they were breakable glass. Claire said gossip in colleges is not an activity but an ecosystem. No one placed a knife upon the table, they only set out the cutlery. I drifted to a newspaper left on a chair. Yesterday's issue, crossword half worked in a pressed, dutiful hand. One clue encircled faintly as though doubt had been embarrassed by its own presence. Candle left, scholar absent, cause unclear. 7. 3 letters written, none certain. I asked whose it was. Foster preferred solutions with only one answer. Ashe finished them between meetings when higher things permitted. Claire considered puzzles restful. The circle felt like a whisper that had not decided yet. A photograph on the mantel showed a garden party. Harland at the frame's edge, attention grazing something out of view. Foster 3/4 turned away, already in conversation with her next sentence. Ashe, leaning into laughter that looked rehearsed. Claire in the centre, seeing not the camera, but the space beyond it. In Harland's hand a glass tilted a degree too far, as if interrupted. Behind him a parasol shadow obscured a figure I could not name. Lewis wondered about the river. Foster said mishap belongs to the inattentive. Ashe observed that Oxford kills slowly with paperwork. Claire said the candle felt wrong. He disliked ceremony. He told me routine is what the timid mistake for character. She let that sit between us until it cooled. "You thought he was planning to leave," I said. "I thought he was tired of being observed," she answered. "A different thing." When we rose, I straightened a portrait that had sagged by a thumb's width. Foster watched and almost smiled. "You like order," she said. "Only when it pretends to be freedom," I told her. Ash asked for progress. I said, "Progress is a word for motion that refuses to declare direction." Claire wanted to know whether I believed he still breathed. "Belief is a poor investigator," I said. Outside, the rain rehearsed the stone again. I kept the crossword, having written a word that satisfied and bothered in the same breath. Lantern. It sat almost properly, and almost is rarely harmless. Candles illuminate what is missing as faithfully as what remains. Somewhere in that pleasant room a pencil had pressed too hard, and however lightly one circles a clue, the circle marks the page for a while. By afternoon the rain thinned to a sift so fine the air seemed dusted with secrecy. Oxford looked newly washed, chastened by its own brightness. I sent Lewis to the archives because Clark's bloom under his attention. He returned with the chill of catalogues clinging to his coat and the expression of a hound that has found where the scent doubles back. He told me there had been, in the late 70s, a fellowship competition that cured several men of illusions. Harland, young and delicate with knives, won with an essay on devotional paradox. The runner-up, braver than wise, submitted a piece that called vanity by its peacock name. Governors were consulted. A donor mentioned continuity. The vacancy evaporated. Reputation, like plaster, sets around the first blow. Files remember what colleges forget. In the minutes, Lewis found a name that reappeared with small corrections, as if someone could not decide how history should be spelled. A photograph had once been pasted to the page and then removed with unskilled fingers, leaving a pale rectangle the size of a face. In a margin, a line from Wyatt had been attributed to Surrey. The error pricked like a burr on worsted. For one who always misquotes, the inscription in Harland's book had said, "Always is a liar." I borrowed the library key and went alone to the north reading room where the air keeps the scent of beeswax and mild neglect. Harland's requested items waited in their grey coffins. The manuscript I wanted was a village of saints and penitents, stitched into vellum, complaints and prayers sharing one narrow bed. On the flyleaf, the same hand as before had left its barb, for one who always misquotes, no signature, only a flourish that closed like a door. I considered candidates who might write with that tidy malice. Ash preferred policies to pens. Foster cut error the way surgeons cut tissue and would have signed. Claire seemed too impatient for anonymous grammar. There remained the invisible ranks, librarians, bursars, a scholar who never recovered from the fellowship's judgment. In Oxford, the living often lend their hands to the dead. Lewis telephoned from the lodge. The ruined candidate's name, he said, appeared again in a bursarial ledger with a slight alteration. Beside it, a notation about travel grants that ceased abruptly. He thought the man had left England. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that the surname matched someone we had met, if one allowed for spelling's flexibility. I told him to let the ledger rest. Numbers confess more fully when left alone to quarrel. I walked the stacks and heard the old wood rehearse its grievances. It is a mercy to be tolerated among books that survived monasteries, reformations, and winter insects. I thought of Harland as a poised young predator of footnotes, learning how to ruin another man while still sounding like a gentleman. Scholarship rewards the calm hand that closes a door quietly. Toward evening, a call reached me at the lodge, precise and almost kind. She said my name had passed her on the quad wind and asked if I remembered a conversation about Purcell and reticence. I told her memory is merely a room with a forgiving window. She laughed the guarded laugh of intelligent women and said she would be in Oxford 2 days, perhaps 3. When the line closed, a silence arranged itself in the receiver, the sort that keeps an old ache polished. Back in the reading room, I let the inscription settle into its smallest parts. Always misquotes. It could mark a habit, or rebuke, or a code by which the writer addressed someone else entirely. A poor satirist names his victim. A better one builds a cage of grammar and invites him to live there. I wrote in my notebook a thin deduction. If the misquotation is deliberate, then the corrector is the message. Outside, bicycles stitched silver commas through the quad. I sat with the manuscript a little longer and waited the way one waits for a clock to remember itself. The past was still speaking. It only needed the room to echo again tonight. The call came when the afternoon chose drizzle. By the time Lewis and I reached the towpath, the Isis lay pewter, reeds black like punctuation. Rowers had gone in, boathouse doors were shut, geese made circuits, Oxford looked away. He lay half-returned in the reeds, as if the river had reconsidered. The porter stood with his cap in both hands. I went down the bank and let the mud keep my shoes. Death altered Harland by subtracting the noise around him. Water had pressed his hair flat. Silt had seated itself along his collar. A tie-pin glinted like a survivor refusing capitulation. A doctor from a nearby surgery arrived damp and conscientious. Drowning perhaps, a blow perhaps. We must leave the argument to a room with better light. He touched a shadow behind the temple and made the gesture that postpones certainty. We stepped back and let the stretcher men perform their grace. No one in Oxford forgets how to carry a scholar, Lewis said. The bank is treacherous here, and added that missteps do not always need enemies. I told him the bruise looked older than the river would choose to make, then wished I had not been so sure. I saw a scuff in the clay where two sets of boots had quarrelled, one heavier, one impatient, and over both the smear the water signs. A small crescent had been pressed and dragged, a glass base, or the heel of a hand doubtful of itself. Something pale threaded a reed head. I teased it free. Linen, or a lie about linen, with a single darker fibre running like a vein. Lewis took it with the silence he keeps for things that demand storage before belief. The porter coughed a memory he had not wished to own. A car idling near the side gate after midnight, 2 nights before, a collar raised, a face turned to avoid ownership. The number, he feared, would not survive inquiry. Numbers are mortal in rain. We waited while the river practiced indifference. A cyclist passed, wheels whispering. On the opposite bank a dog discovered a stick and shook meaning from it. I stood with the drizzle teaching patience and felt the old line return, not Brooks, though he is borrowed whenever elegy wants a mirror. In darkness a candle answers its own question. The candle in Harland's study had answered too loudly. Here the answer had become whisper and then river. The master arrived without umbrella, the better to look wronged by weather. "Closure, Inspector," he said, as if it were a service. I told him the river hires no accountants. Miriam Foster telephoned to ask for facts, as though facts were sterile creatures one could keep in glass. Leonard Ashe inquired about the timing of inquests. His voice wore the tidy shoes of administration. Claire left a message written not to cut the hand that writes it. We walked away upriver, where the bank gives back to meadow and the city pretends not to overhear. 2 impressions, I said to Lewis, and the lighter set refuses the slope. He nodded, seeing what I had seen, though we both knew the mud enjoys imitation. He asked whether the bruise could be ceremonial, a river's token, not an adversary's. If ceremony, I said, then performed earlier, elsewhere. The drizzle answered by continuing. They took Harland away, and with him the college's comfortable idea that death belongs to the elderly and the uninteresting. The towpath resumed its anonymous labour of puddles. I thought of the inscription on the manuscript, for one who always misquotes, and of the photograph whose face had been erased with clumsy fidelity. The bruise settled beside those in my mind like a blot that refuses to dry. Under Folly Bridge, the sound turned from weather into instrument. I took out the crossword the common room had abandoned. River's gift conceals maker's mark. 7. I let the squares remain empty. The Isis spoke without grammar, and I understood that the sentence would lengthen before it ended. I put the paper away and watched the current move with the stubborn humility of something carrying more than it announces. The river's stubborn grey followed me back to the college, insinuating itself into corridors and the smell of beeswaxed oak. I asked the porter for Harlan's keys and the permission that follows grief. He provided both with the bureaucracy of sorrow. In the study, the afternoon light lay thin as tracing paper. Lewis opened the top drawer as if it might exhale. It did. A letter waited beneath a folio of lecture notes, its paper thick, its ink careful enough to demand belief. He read first, and his face took on the tidy conviction that makes constables useful and occasionally wrong. He said it was from Claire Davenant, and that tenderness often finds the shortest path to a river. I asked him to pass it and let me be the philosopher. The hand leaned slightly forward, a gait unafraid of destination. The language allowed secrecy to preen. You know where you are most yourself. The candle cannot pretend to warmth. I'm tired of being someone's footnote. It felt like a confession rehearsed at an empty window. Lewis believed the river had answered. He wanted a warrant, or at least the small satisfaction of a door opened more briskly than courtesy permits. I told him the letter had been written by a woman educated to leave fewer fingerprints than passion permits. One sentence refused to lie down. She had written that a poem he loved was by Brooke, and that she used to misquote it to annoy him. In the common room, Claire had dismissed Brooke with the quick snap of a scholar who keeps him for students. The inconsistencies scratched. I read again. The paper felt new, the envelope older, a salvage from a drawer. The signature was full, yet one letter stumbled as if its owner had disguised her natural shorthand. Forgery is rarely theatrical. It prefers the plausible. I thought of the inscription in the medieval manuscript and felt the same thin tug, for one who always misquotes. It is not only poets who suffer correction. Lewis reported that Ash had left the college near midnight, claiming a drive around the ring road to clear a headache. The junior porter, with commendable attention and unfortunate eyesight, had written a number with one digit like a smudge. Rain is the defendant's friend. Ash told me later that he drives when problems require untangling. The city looks cleaner when it is moving past. I told him roads seldom absolve. He smiled with the kind of patience that reads as strategy. We traced petrol receipts and found none. The garage near the bridge remembered a man in a dark coat buying cigarettes he did not want and glancing twice at the clock. The assistant thought the car was blue. The proprietor thought it was black. Both agreed that cash made colour unimportant. Lewis said Ash had motive, an ambiguous alibi, and the administrative talent to plan a candle as if it were a meeting agenda. I said committees can stage tragedies with fewer witnesses than theatres. Back in the study, I laid Claire's letter beside a half-sheet Harlan had used for notes. A faint transfer marked the margin where the letter had rested too long. Dust tells its own chronology. If Claire had written, she had also supplied an error she does not make. Claire uses the Oxford comma as if it were a duty. The letter refused it, neat where she is pedantic. She writes he and I without the childishness of italics. The letter dressed pronouns in emphases like theatre. She never writes yours in any sense. The letter bowed at the end with a yours that bent too low. Tiny treacheries, and yet treacheries all the same. We went to see her. In her rooms near Jericho, she listened, calm, already tired of being named. She said she had written to him earlier in the term about a seminar on misquotation and that he had mocked her fondness for Brooke. She denied the Rivers appointment with a steadiness that felt earned. I asked for a sample of her recent hand. She provided a note to her cleaner with a bleak domestic grace. The commas stood where duty placed them. The script was Claire's, but the letter in the drawer belonged to someone impersonating neatness. On the pavement afterwards, Lewis asked whether I meant to arrest romance. Not romance, I told him, only the performance of it. He said the letter was enough for any Crown prosecutor with an appetite. I said appetite is not a palate. He asked where I would put my coin. Toward a driver who visited a clock and a cigarette he did not need, I said, and toward a scholar who believes the neatest lie is a borrowed truth. At the lodge, the drizzle lifted and left the flagstones stunned into brightness. I placed the letter beside Claire's note on the counter and let their differences object to marriage. The porter watched us with the careful indifference of men who keep histories in keys. Lewis sighed the sigh of those who prefer a straight path to a maze. I unfolded the crossword rescued from the common room and found a clue I had overlooked. Lover's token proves false when commas missing 7. I did not fill the squares. Some answers prefer the dignity of arriving in their own time, and commas, like alibis, fail most eloquently where they ought to be invisible. Rain retired for an hour, and in that reprieve the college elected to rehearse virtue. We were sent to the chapel, emptied of piety and newly stocked with plywood sin. Candles, electric and obedient, flickered to remind us of austerity without hazard. The stage manager aligned crosses on the floor like a private liturgy. The play was a morality piece Harland had petted into life, an exercise in allegory and the punishment of weak ankles. He liked its severity, so I was told, the way it requires a man to speak to his own vices plainly, and then lose the argument. I took a seat near the back, where the stone keeps an older chill. Lewis leaned beside me with the tolerant look of a man who has seen traffic, and believes it the greater mystery. They began. Time, a willowy postgraduate with grave hair, advised mankind to remember the hour is shorter than he thinks. Pride entered in a borrowed doublet and borrowed certainty. I let the words wash across the nave, reading faces rather than text, because faces are rarely misquoted. Midway through, a figure named Counsel mounted a little pulpit and recited lines Harland had once used to open a lecture. "When I am dead, think only this of me," he stated, letting the chapel hold the sentence like an heirloom. I felt the old itch rise. It was the Brookline again, parked where Harland would never have left it. I closed my eyes and saw the inscription on the manuscript's flyleaf, the tidy malice of "for one who always misquotes." I heard Claire deny fondness for Brooke with the briskness of a scholar who keeps her sympathies under lock. I remembered Ash's effusions about continuity, a word that frightens change into tidier rooms. And I tasted the letter in Harland's drawer, its commas misbehaving as though they had been asked to play someone else's music. Lewis leaned slightly. He asked, without asking, whether the line held meaning or merely tidiness. I told him, without telling, that the neatness bothered me. If Counsel repeats the very error Harland corrected by living, then either the director is a pedant's enemy, or someone has dressed the stage as a footnote. Evidence should resist performance. This had rehearsed itself too well. The rehearsal limped to its conclusion. Afterwards I asked the director where he found that Brooke line. He said the advisor had supplied it months ago, scribbled in the margin of a photocopy with an initial he assumed stood for Harland. I asked to see the copy. The initial was firm enough, but its flourish closed like ashes, not Harland's tidy cliff. We visited the prop table, that altar to relevance. Among ropes and paper crowns lay a candle stub, genuine wax rather than electrics marked with soot, as if tested in private. I thought of the porter's entry. Candle lit, door locked. Theatre had borrowed from life or the other way about. A girl from the chorus, all nerves and good intentions, told us the Brook line had been corrected in rehearsal last term and then quietly reinstated. The correction, she said, came on a small card placed upon the music stand one evening and gone the next. She remembered because the card smelled faintly of clove and old envelopes. I stood under the gallery where the sound decides whether to be echo or judgment. It was all too curated. The letter, the inscription, the misquotation repeated in public where I would be certain to hear it. Someone had drawn a circle and invited me to remain inside its neatness. Neatness is not innocence. It is more often camouflage. When we left, Rain had returned careful, almost polite. Lewis asked if I felt progress. I told him I felt arrangement. He said arrangement is progress with better manners. I kept the photocopy and the girl's memory and the scent of clove that had no business in a chapel. The wind moved along the cloister like a reader, turning a page he does not fully trust. Somewhere a door clicked discreetly, as if approving the evening's arrangement of careful lies. Rain chased us down Walton Street. Claire's building wore the resigned look of student leases. She let us in without theatre, said she was tired of being auditioned for a part she never wanted, and stood aside. The flat smelled of paper and boiled kettle. A bicycle leaned against a bookcase. She produced the diary herself, a gesture that ought to have been absolution but wasn't. It was the usual small intensity, pages ruled, dates pre-printed, corners softened by a term's friction. Lewis took a careful breath after the first glance. There it was, the week we needed, and there, under the night the river remembered, a neat note that made certainty convenient, with J.H. discuss candle and conscience, 9. Claire said it looked bad and added that life had never minded looking bad when it was telling the truth. She had been at Jericho, she said, friends, whiskey, then home, a lost key. She watched me read as if hoping the margins might defend her. I asked to turn the earlier pages. She nodded with a tired permission. The year began tidy, then frayed. By Lent, ink wandered and appointments apologized for themselves. Then, abruptly, order returned in the week of Harland's disappearance. The hand there was calmer, the lines straighter, the J's looped just so. Only the paper betrayed the imposture. It was thicker than its neighbours, a paler cream, and when I held the book to the window, the counterfeit page cast a brighter square. Lewis asked if she had rewritten her life after the fact. She said she is vain, not foolish, and that vanity prefers silence to forgery. I slid a fingernail beneath the gutter of the binding. Glue objected, and then let go with a small, resigned sigh. The inserted leaf came free, smelling faintly of clove, and a filing cabinet opened too long. On the underside, along the spine, I found the ghost of a printer's code. The diary's true leaves had no such birthmark. Whoever planted the page had used stationery excised from another volume, then shaved the edge to fit. The cut was crude, but careful enough for darkness. I thought of the rehearsal card with its clove breath, and of the photocopy, whose initial closed like a gate. Evidence had been stitched into our days with a needle, too theatrical. I asked Claire whether she owned clove cigarettes. She said she had given up pretenses at charm years ago. I asked whether anyone borrowed the diary. She laughed without moving her mouth. Borrowing and diaries are not cousins, Inspector. The River Knight's entry had a comma missing where Claire always insists upon one. The 9 was written as a looped G. In her lecture notes, the 9 falls straight, a stem without embroidery. I laid her notes beside the diary and let their differences disagree. Lewis saw it and said nothing, which is his way of learning. We spoke of Harland then, not as legend, but as the man who looked over a page and misliked laziness. She said he found her appetite for paradox charming until it threatened to eat something he loved. I asked whether that something was his chair, his serenity, or his reputation in photographs. She said all three, and then, more quietly, that she had told him she would leave Oxford before she let him curate her future. I closed the diary and gave it back. I told her that someone had written a play around her life and preferred an ending with handcuffs. She said she had never looked well in bracelets. Lewis allowed himself the smallest exhalation. We were not done with her, but she had been retired from the front row. She thanked us in the tone of a woman who knows gratitude is provisional. Outside, Jericho smelled of rain and chip fat and the tang of bicycles. The city turned its corners with practiced secrecy. I thought of the candle, the river, the misquotation that refused to leave, and the tidy circle our mystery drew about itself. Someone, somewhere, believed literature could guarantee guilt. They were almost right. Almost is where Oxford lives. Evening arrived like a verdict no one wished to hear. I let the flat learn my tread again, hung the damp coat where it could think, and poured a claret that behaved like a conversation resumed after a quarrel. The first bars of Wagner arranged themselves in the room. Music solves nothing. It persuades the mind to try a different staircase. I sat without turning on the lamp. The city beyond the window kept its tiny contracts, a bus sighing, a bicycle finishing an argument with a gate, rain putting a soft grammar on the glass. I set the day's debris in a semicircle on the table, the photocopied script, Claire's counterfeit page, the porter's entry doubting its final number, and the letter that wanted to be love. Why light a candle in a study locked from within if one intends not to return? Habit is the dullest suspect. Harland was many things, but he did not practice devotion to wax. The candle announced presence, yet the room was curated to signify absence, a stage direction rather than a prayer. The river returned, uninvited. Harland half returned from it, a bruise that spoke before water could. Lewis had argued for accident with a careful mercy. The mud answered with 2 sets of boots and a hesitation shaped like a hand. On the manuscript's flyleaf, the sting still pricked, for one who always misquotes. The rehearsal had served Brooke incorrectly, and someone ensured the error stayed on the menu. Claire's letter copied the trick with commas trained to misbehave. Too much precision, I thought, in planting disorder. I tried dutifully to imagine Claire as architect. She is clever enough for almost anything and romantic enough for nothing foolish. But the inserted leaf carried a printer's code she would recognize and ignore. The clove breath belonged to a pocket where administrative keys jostle, not to a woman finishing an essay at midnight. Her denial did not perform innocence. It simply refused melodrama, the stage it craves. Wagner travelled from brass to regret. I let another inch of claret advise me. The wrong digit in the license plate worried like a loose tooth. An error written in rain becomes character. A junior porter who second-guesses himself is a tool shaped by someone else's hand. Ashy had left by the side gate because the main one sticks in wet weather. The line wore the wholesome shine of a rehearsed truth. He bought cigarettes he did not smoke and consulted a clock he already knew. I stood, and let the leitmotifs arrange themselves like chess a cathedral might approve. The fellowship scandal Lewis exhumed returned, smelling of basement. A young Harland had learned how to prosper by precision. A rival had learned how long a college remembers a photograph had been torn out with clumsy care. If a son inherits a fortune, he can inherit a wound with equal tidiness. The candle, the brookline, the staged ardour, the diary leaf shaved to fit, the number that shrugged off its final digit, each gesture performed culture, not jealousy, which is noisy, but ambition, which is educated enough to whisper. Revenge requires quotation marks, envy prefers footnotes. I stopped the record and listened to the room. The silence helped itself to corners. In that pause, the pieces moved. The candle was advertisement, the play an echo chamber, the letter a forged compliment, the diary a prop, the late drive a walk around an alibi. This was not passion's chaos. It was the tidy malice of a man who studies systems and enjoys their obedience. Lewis telephoned. He asked whether I had found the river's maker's mark. Not yet, I told him, but I believe I have the craftsman. He said he would sleep badly, and I said sleep is the body's diplomacy. After the lines softened into dial tone, I stood by the window and watched a neighbour coax a light to life. In darkness, a candle answers its own question, I thought again, and felt the old ache that accompanies realization when it arrives too late for mercy. The wine ended its argument. The night kept its counsel. Quietly, the archive kept its own weather, dry as an old sermon, chill as a kept promise. I asked for Leonard Ashe there because paper dislikes performance, and men like Ashe grow smaller when surrounded by records that will outlast them. The archivist arranged a lamp, a table, a box marked Fellows, Appointments, and other disappointments. Lewis lingered by the door, a punctuation mark prepared to harden. Ashe arrived with the practiced briskness that persuades committees to trust deadlines. We began not with accusation, but with the photograph re-adhered where someone had once torn it free. A garden party, midsummer. Harland young and angled like a blade. Beside him, a man whose eyes believed in a future he would not receive. The penciled caption supplied the introduction I had expected, Edwin Ashe. He touched the margin with a finger that wished to look scholarly and only looked familial. The college, he said, had a habit of avoiding embarrassment by postponing justice until it resembled mercy. I said postponement had ripened into your life like a second career. I admired Harland, he said, because one should admire one's executioner. Admiration is orderly. I laid out the reliquary. The candle stub with soot where caution had tested theatre. The photocopy bearing an initial that closed like his, not Harland's. The diary leaf shaved to fit a life it did not live, still breathing clove. The porter's book with its digit taught to blur. The petrol receipt that never existed because the clock you consulted was the true alibi. He watched like a man seeing a chessboard confirm a position offered days before. "What made you certain?" he asked. "Misquotation," I said. "Your father corrected lines in meetings. Harland, who preferred ice to argument, remembered. You trained the play to speak Brook in a chapel he had colonized with pedantry. You posted a proverb to the river and waited for it to return with a body." Paper listened. Then he spoke in the voice of a bursar who has balanced a painful ledger. Revenge is a patient bookkeeper. He lit the candle and locked the door because Harland liked being seen without being available. He planted the leaf because Claire would have been believed. He scented it because scent lingers where truth is lazy. He asked Harland to meet him by the water, with reconciliation folded into the summons. He had not intended drowning. They grappled. The bank decided. Lewis shifted a quiet thunder. I asked why the car and the cigarettes. Performance, he said, is the ally of plausibility. I asked why now. A chair was opening, and history refused to open with it. Some doors must be remade. He looked at his father's name as if it were a cheque that never cleared. I thought of the fellowship minutes with their bleeding corrections, of a young man learning the art of being postponed. I thought of Harland, whose precision had grown fat from other men's hunger. The archive made everyone equal by dusting them the same. Even bitterness looked boxed and labelled. I told Ash the law would not admire his tidiness. The law and tidiness, he said, have always been strangers. He wanted only exposure, a scholar findable, reputation damp, but intact, justice paid in public coin. He arrived second at the truth, and second men learn to manage outcomes. There was no triumph, only the cool of habit, hardened into principle. I looked again at the photograph. Harland, smiling with the mouth, not the eyes. Edwin Ash turned toward a voice we could not hear. In the corner, a boy with a face like Leonard's waited for someone to define fairness. We do not solve cases, we arrange their ruins. A page closed, the dust forgave nothing. Lewis gathered the courtesies that lead to handcuffs. Ash raised his hands with bureaucratic resignation. The lamp hummed, the papers settled. Deep in the stacks a binding creaked like an old door deciding to keep its hinge. Outside, rain waited at the gate. I signed the log and left, carrying the photograph's shadow in my pocket, the way one keeps a coin that will never be spent. The cloisters breathed differently once Ash was led away. The echo of his steps lingered longer than his words. A man accustomed to winning arguments with patience, now reduced to following another man's pace. The college closed around itself with a sigh of relief that sounded perilously close to shame. Windows shut more quickly, doors acquired locks where courtesy once sufficed. Oxford, when scandal has passed, does not weep. It tidies. I walked the quad as rain rehearsed itself against the flagstones. Harland's study window loomed above, blind now its candle, long since consumed. Presence by absence, and that was the image that refused to let me go. A scholar's room arranged for solitude, then staged for a performance that ended by the river. If envy has a candle, it is lit not to guide, but to accuse. Lewis joined me beneath the cloister. He said the porter had been in tears, though of what he wasn't sure, the death, the deceit, or the fear that his logbook might be called to testify against him. We stood a moment listening to the college settle its accounts with silence. I thought of Harland, sharp as a scalpel in youth, dulled by the comfort of reputation, and wondered if he knew the exact moment brilliance became habit. In the archive box, the photograph still waited, Harland's smile beside Edwin Ash's thwarted eyes. I had placed it there again before leaving, letting paper keep its own vigil. The son had shouldered his father's wound until it bent into violence. There was a symmetry in it, as cold as mathematics and just as unforgiving. Later in my flat, I opened a claret that had been waiting for an evening less compromised than this one. Lewis came because he dislikes leaving me with Wagner when the case is still cooling. He talked of his children, how one had taken to cycling late at night, and another had misquoted Milton in an essay. He laughed at the misquotation, the sort of affectionate rebuke Harland might once have offered, before irony grew stale in his mouth. I poured us each a second glass. He asked whether I believed Ash, when he said he had not meant murder. I told him intent is a currency we pretend to count, though the exchange rate is always uncertain. What I believed was the candle, too neat, too visible, a gesture that belonged to theatre, not accident. Lewis nodded, though I knew the nod meant only that he heard me. Family, he said, can make men clumsy in the strangest ways. When he left, the room resumed its quiet. I turned the lamp down and sat in the half-dark with the crossword. A clue lingered unsolved. Flame's end shows what word cannot. 8. I traced the squares with the tip of my pencil and let them remain empty. There is an honesty in leaving things unfinished. The study window returned to me then, the porter's gaze, the flicker mistaken for presence, the silence inside. A candle promises until it gutters. Harlan's life had burned toward brilliance, then settled into wax. Ashes had smouldered on bitterness until smoke obscured every other possibility. Both wasted, though in different tongues. I raised the last of the claret and said aloud, not for company but because some lines need to be heard, the light shines in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. The words fell without echo. Beyond the glass, Oxford lay in drizzle, the streets a dim constellation of lamps, each one both flame and shadow. And in that quiet I thought again how candles illuminate absence as faithfully as presence, and how often it is the absence that remains,